Russia just issued a warning, Colonel, of a major false flag operation that is set to hit Ukraine's grain infrastructure. Ukraine is now walking back claims about the destruction of an apartment complex that killed dozens of civilians. Any word on that, Colonel?
Well, as far as the apartment complex is concerned, it looks as though an anti-aircraft missile fired by the Ukrainians struck an incoming Russian missile, and the debris from the strike fell on the apartment building. In other words, it was by no means a deliberate attack on civilian infrastructure. All this business about Russians are attacking civilian infrastructure and killing civilians has always been a lot of nonsense. It's just not true.
Putin's who want him to go full force with a major invasion and get it over with. What's the truth here?
Well, first of all, I think we were much more indiscriminate in Vietnam than you realize. So, in fact, I would argue that we and the British were extremely indiscriminate during World War II, and that tradition carried on through all the subsequent wars that we fought. On the other hand, I don't think Putin has to destroy large numbers of civilian lives or civilian infrastructure in order to win. And I think he knows that. Look, we've got over, 10, 11 million displaced in Ukraine.
Right.
There were maybe 35 million people in the country. They used to say, well, there were 40 million Ukrainians, but certainly in the first 10, 15 years of this century, at least 9 or 10 million Ukrainians simply left because they couldn't find work and they couldn't work through the corruption in the country. So there were never as many Ukrainians in Ukraine to begin with as originally expected. So when you look at that, that means you're back to 25 million Ukrainians left inside the country, and more are still trying to leave. So I think Putin knows he doesn't have to kill them to be successful. Now, the bad news is the Ukrainians have done exactly what we've seen the Palestinians and others in the Middle East do to the Israelis. They do set up gun positions and missile launchers in civilian areas. When that happens, you have no choice. You have to go after it, and you hope for the best as far as collateral damage is concerned. But I always push back against this because I've spent a lot of time with the Israelis, and I do know something about the Russians because I did go there and I had some interaction with the military. They're not interested in killing civilians. They just aren't. It's no way to win. They understand that very clearly.
Terrible situation, because if the Russians are massing 1.5 million troops now, or whatever the number is, they have an army of 1.5 million active that they're building up. They're going to launch how many people in their winter offensive? How many troops?
Well, this is 6 weeks ago, we accounted for 550,000 that would be part of the force that attacks Ukraine in the winter. Since then, I think they've added another 100,000, but most of the 100,000 they've added are in support roles, medical evacuation infrastructure, transportation, railheads, ammunition handlers, this kind of thing. As far as the 1.5 million, they're nowhere near that yet. And that's the sad outcome of our stupidity in this Ukrainian operation. We have literally induced the Russians to regain their former position as a major continental military
Unbelievable. Power. And our military readiness level is lower than ever, correct?
It's pathetic.
What's
Look, we can't even recruit. We have 457,000 troops in the United States Army. I mean, that's ridiculous. For a nation of our size, we should be able to maintain an army of 600,000 without batting.
You clearly explained that the Patriots are a very limited system, very limited number of missiles, and they're made mainly for protecting a city infrastructure and nothing more. So what is this all about? I mean, they're sending Tiger tanks from Germany, from.
No. Let me stop you there. I just was told that Schultz, who is a disappointing figure to say the least, has now sent a message to Biden in Washington that the Germans will not send any Leopard tanks unless the United States is willing to send its own tanks. And since we are unwilling to send any tanks, this means the Germans won't send their tanks. Now, I mean, there's almost nobody I can think of on the European continent that is more disappointing than Schultz. Perhaps Macron runs him a close second. But I must say, I'm glad that Schultz at least has managed to find the strength to push this ball into Biden's court. And he's making a point. Look, if we're not willing to provide them, and we have 7 or 8,000 M1 series tanks. Of course, most of them aren't in very good shape. They're sitting in what we call boneyards in most cases. Then why should the Germans chip in and send their tanks?
Well, Zelensky wants Abrams tanks. He wants nothing but the best.
Of course. Well, that's because he doesn't know that the Abrams tank is a gas guzzler par excellence.
As you pointed out on this.
Basically, no, I mean, if you're going to make a choice from the standpoint of logistics, you're much better off with the German tank.
What is the Tiger? Is it a derivation of the old Panther tanks?
No, it's a Leopard. It's well, if you look at all of the tanks that we have, if you look at the tanks that we built after the Second World War, they were all patterned on the German tanks of the Second World War, particularly the Tiger and the Panther.
Interesting.
The one breakaway model is the Merkava that the Israelis produce, because that was the first one to include a compartment in the back of the tank where you could carry infantry or medical supplies or extra ammunition. And they put the engine in the front of the vehicle, which meant that you instantaneously added tremendous protection to the crew, because in addition to the normal armor, you now had the engine in front, which would stop additional projectiles. Because the point is, in war, you want the crew to survive. You can always provide another tank. Of course,
but the engine in front makes it more vulnerable to immediate explosion, doesn't it, by being hit by it?
No, not the way it's built. They built the compartment so the compartment is insulated from any explosion up front. So the engine really adds to protection.
Interesting.
That's why the Merkava is such an excellent vehicle, and it's unfortunate that we haven't paid more attention to it. But anyway, other than that, the Leopard is just the Leopard 4, which is what they're talking about, is a very fine tank. Does everything ours can do and more, and it's not a fuel problem.
Did you have anything to do with the Israeli tank development? I'm just curious, because you're a tank man.
No, that man has just passed away. Actually, he was a very interesting man, kind of a cantankerous character, as you can imagine.
Please, an Israeli being cantankerous? You must be joking.
Yeah. No, but no, he passed away recently. But no, I didn't. But I'm just an admirer, and of course, the thing they do, which we're unwilling to do, is that they simply take out a fresh piece of paper, they sit down, and they draw something new, and say, "Let's go try this." And they'll tinker with it and experiment with it under all sorts of conditions until they get something that works. We tend to build on whatever is already there, another version of it, or, it becomes a Rube Goldberg device. It has to have, 16 different weapon systems on it, and it has to protect against 5,000 different threats. That sort of thing never works. The Israelis don't have that problem.
They're not worried about white supremacy in the plans.
Well, the enemy, if you're an Israeli, the enemy is at your gates.
But, Colonel, and here the enemy's through the gates.
Yes.
We won't go into that one. So 1.5 million people, we talked about that. Yesterday, NATO surveillance planes deployed to Romania. What's that about?
Well, first of all, I don't know what specific planes they're talking about, if they're fighters or whatever. It looks to me right now as though we're doing a lot of things out of a sense of desperation. Let me explain.
Desperation.
When you talk to someone who's in finance, in the markets, you'll hear people routinely say, what are the fundamentals? What are the fundamentals? Before I invest in something, what are the fundamentals? Before I invest in the market, what are the fundamentals? When we decided, or the sainted leadership in Washington decided to unleash this war on Russia, which is really what happened. The Russians simply responded to try and defend themselves after they'd lost thousands of Russians in the two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, to Ukrainian artillery and rocket fire. And they saw this huge Ukrainian army building up in preparation for an attack. The Russians said, that's enough. We're going to put an end to this. But when we decided to go pedal to the metal, so to say, we failed to address the fundamentals. First, can you isolate your opponent? The answer is no, you can't isolate Russia. You can't isolate it from other countries. You can't isolate its markets. You can't isolate its industries. Second, can you starve it of resources? No, they have all of the resources that they need. How much can you hurt it given the position of their economy? Well, their economy is not the strongest, but their economy is not really vulnerable to much that we can do to it because it's not that closely integrated with the rest of the world. So all of those mistakes were made up front. Then the second was, well, look at these Russians. They staggered into eastern Ukraine. They didn't come in with guns blazing. They seem to have made all of these terrible mistakes. Yet nobody listened to Putin when he said, we don't really want to kill large numbers of Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. We're not here to murder people. We want a negotiated settlement. So his operation was designed from the beginning to be limited and to demonstrate the seriousness with which they were treating the strategic question of Ukraine's membership in NATO and its position geopolitically vis-a-vis Russia. Well, we decided to ignore all of that. And for 90 days, Putin, frankly, I think, persisted in the delusion that he was going to find somebody to talk to end it. Finally, after 90 days, they said, well, this isn't going to work. And they went over to the defense and economy of force measure, made decisions about mobilization, committing additional forces, changing out the command structure, altering the command structure. So here we sit now at the end of this process, and the Russians are now prepared to strike a crushing blow. In the meantime, they've continued to incrementally strengthen their position in the south and conduct limited operations designed, for the most part, to entice the Ukrainians into attacking, which they've done, which has cost the Ukrainians immense numbers of soldiers. Now, right now, we're looking at 122,000 dead Ukrainians in uniform that we can pinpoint. In addition to that, the Ukrainians admit that they have 35,000 more Ukrainian soldiers missing in action. Well, those are presumed dead. So now you're talking about 157,000 dead Ukrainian troops, another 400,000 wounded because the hospitals are bursting with wounded, terrible wounds. And the Russians, meantime, have lost, we estimate, between 16 and 20,000 dead, and perhaps 20, 30, 40,000 wounded at the most. So what has happened is that Ukraine has drained itself of strength, of power, of capability, and the Russians are now peaking. They're stronger than they've ever been. Their force is stronger than it's been in 30 years, and is going to get much stronger after this war. And as a result, I think everyone in Washington is saying, we've got to ship everything we can before it's too late. The problem is, it is too late. Ukraine has no chance whatsoever of winning.